In this video, I'll help you select the best compost. There are so many options to choose from. Vermicompost, mushroom compost, manure compost, your own homemade compost. I mean, which of these are best? And even if you select manure compost, you have more choices. Horse, cow, sheep. What's the difference and why would you choose one over the other? That's the topic for this video. I'm going to break the video into two parts. In the first part, we're going to discuss a variety of different types of compost so you understand what they are. And I'm going to put up a timestamp for each one of these so that you can go directly to the compost that interests you. The second part of this video is going to be a review of all the composts, and I'm going to help you select the best one. If you want to become a better gardener, it's really important that you understand the differences between these composts and why you would select one over the other. Because your application really is important in the selection process. But I know some of you just want a quick answer. So here's my quick answer. The very best compost is homemade compost and municipal compost. The second best compost is going to be composted manure. And there's really not a lot of difference between cow, sheep, and pig. Out of those, I generally pick sheep manure because it tends to have a little bit higher nutrient value, but they're pretty much the same. Before we discuss the compost, I'd like you to understand why we use it. I mean, everybody recommends it. Everybody says it's good for the garden, but most people don't really understand why they're adding it to the garden. I mean, why use compost instead of fertilizer? One of the main reasons you're adding compost to the garden is to provide nutrients. That NPK, nitrogen, phosphate, potassium, and all the micronutrients. Compost is a good source of those, but it has very low levels. The NPK of most compost is about 1-1-1. Now, if we compare that to fertilizer, fertilizers have number like 10-10-10. Which means synthetic fertilizer has 10 times the amount of nutrients. So why wouldn't you just use fertilizer? A lot of people have the misconception that synthetic fertilizer harms plants. Those salts in that fertilizer damages the soil and harms microbes. That's complete nonsense. That is a very common myth, but it just doesn't make any sense. If I take compost and I take fertilizer, they both give plants the exact same nutrient molecules. They both release nitrates, and the plants use nitrate. They both release phosphate, and the plants use phosphate. If synthetic fertilizer damages soils and harms microbes, so does compost. But the reality is that neither one does. So if you're looking to add nutrients to your garden, compost is not necessarily your best choice. But there is a very important difference everyone seems to ignore. The nutrients in fertilizer are released almost instantly. The ones in compost are released very slowly over a long period of time, and we're talking years. Slow feeding of your plants is better for plant growth in most cases. In the vegetable garden, you want to fast feed, and so synthetic fertilizers are better. The other reason to use compost is that it adds organic matter. It's the carbon component of that that's so important for building soil structure. Synthetic fertilizer and liquid fertilizers, even if they're organic, add almost no organic matter. They don't add the carbon material. You need the bulk to add that. And that's critical for building soil structure. And soil structure results in much better plant growth. So one of the main reasons you're using compost is to get organic matter into the soil to build better soil. Now let's have a look at different kinds of compost. Homemade compost. Now this could be made in a variety of different ways. The traditional way is to make a fairly big pile, get the greens and browns in the right ratio, and that pile will heat up, and we call that hot composting. But a lot of people make smaller piles and they don't worry so much about the browns and greens. So it won't heat up, but it still produces compost. It's just slower that way. Other people like tumblers because they can rotate them every day. Some people make leaf mold. They just collect the leaves in the fall, pile them up, and wait for nature to decompose that material. All of these processes produce about the same type of compost. Has the same nutrients, it has the same organic matter. Some processes are faster than others, but they're almost the same. Home compost has a good amount of NPK and a good level of organic matter, and those are the key things we're after. It's also free, except for the work you have to do to make it. But there are a couple downsides to home composting. The first one is that most of us can't produce enough compost for a garden. It also has some downsides that people never talk about. The main one is pathogens. Most home gardeners do not get their pile hot enough to kill pathogens. So those pathogenic organisms are in home compost. And then you spread them in your gardens, you put them in your vegetable bed. Now, personally, I think the risk of these is really, really low. And I don't worry about it. But some people do feel it's a valid reason not to use home compost. Now, if you get your piles really hot for long enough, you do overcome that problem. But very few gardeners do that. Municipal compost. So this is produced by your city or township. You take your organic material, your kitchen scraps, your garden waste, and you put it in a green bin. It's taken away to the city. They go through a composting process, and then they make that compost available to the people who live there. The processes they use are quite good. Sometimes they use very large piles and they get that compost really hot, so all the pathogens are killed. A lot of municipalities are now putting them into large containers, and they control the composting process really well. This ensures a really good product that is free of pathogens. Municipalities also test their compost to ensure that they don't contain heavy metals. The downside to municipal compost is that a lot of it contains bits of plastic. A lot of the material they collect comes in green garbage bags, and although that gets shredded and a lot of it gets pulled out, there's still some left. And so I've seen a lot of complaints about the little bits of garbage that are in that compost. In most cases, it's also only available as a bulk material, but the upside to that is it's usually free. So this is a good option for your compost. My third compost is sewage sludge. Now, marketing people have started calling this biosolid. That makes the product sound so much cleaner and more environmentally friendly. But this is actually a good compost to consider. All of the stuff that goes down your drain and down your toilet ends up going to the city for processing. They extract a lot of the water, and what's left is a solid material that has a fairly high organic matter. A lot of it is human poop. This material is then composted and made available for agriculture. And in some cases, you can actually buy the material, usually as bagged compost. Now, this material has a fairly high NPK and a good organic matter level, so it is good for the garden. It's also good for the environment because we have to do something with this material. If we don't use it in our gardens, it gets dumped somewhere, either in natural areas or in the ocean. So it's better off if we use it. The composting process is very well controlled, so the material is pathogen-free. It's usually tested for heavy metals, so we know it's not contaminated with those. In the US, biosolids are graded, and a grade A means that it has no pathogens, no heavy metals, and it's suitable for use in agriculture to produce food. So it's quite safe to use in your garden. Now, there are some downsides to it. One is the ick factor. I mean, who wants to use this on their vegetables? But if you think about this a little bit, what's the difference between using cow dung and human dung? There really is no difference. Both will grow great plants. Now, there is some concern about chemical contamination. Think about all the industry you have in town. They're taking some chemicals and flushing them down their drain, and that gets mixed into the rest of the material. So there is some concern about a chemical contamination with biosolid. But for the most part, this material is quite safe. The next compost on my list is composted manure. And the three common ones are cow, horse, and sheep. The first question people always ask is, what's the difference and which one is best? Because for some reason, wherever you see it on sale, they always have all three. The short answer is they're essentially the same thing. They usually have the same NPK, They have about the same amount of organic material. Doesn't really make a lot of difference. Sheep generally has a slightly higher nutrient value, so if I have a choice, that's the one I pick. Now this material is collected from farms, it's put into big piles, it's composted in a hot process. This material is pathogen free. When this material is sold as bagged product, it has also been tested to make sure there's no other contaminants like heavy metals. Now you can get animal manure in bulk, then you're getting compost that's based on whatever manure that farm had. This material never gets tested. Now, personally, I don't think that's a real risk, but some people get concerned over that. They'd rather buy it in bags. Composted manure is a good product, has a decent amount of NPK, high organic levels. It's available as bagged material from a lot of stores, which makes it very convenient. It's also available as a bulk material, which is usually much cheaper. The one concern some people have is that farmers may use things like antibiotics and other drugs on their animals. That ends up in the manure and therefore ends up in the compost. So that can be a problem. There's also a second concern. Farmers who grow the food for these animals sometimes use herbicides. Those herbicides can survive the process of going through the animal and being composted. So you can end up with composted manure that has a herbicide level that's high enough to kill seedlings. So you do have to be careful where you're getting this material. Now, herbicide levels are generally not a problem if you're using bagged material. If you're concerned about this, it's pretty easy to check to see if your compost will harm seedlings. And I have a video that will show you how to do that. Mushroom compost. What is it? Well, companies that produce mushrooms need a really high quality compost to do that. Mushrooms aren't grown in soil, they're grown in compost. So to start that process, they have to make compost. They collect whatever material they can locally. Manure is a big component of that. They pile it all up. They usually add some gypsum, which adds calcium to the mix. They're making large amounts of this, so they're using a hot composting process. That kills all the pathogens. And then they use that material to grow the mushrooms. Once they've harvested the mushrooms, this material becomes a waste product for them. They have to get rid of it. And that's good for gardeners. Some companies take that material, bag it up, and sell it. Other companies just pile it somewhere and let gardeners come in and help themselves. I have a mushroom farmer not far from me, and they generally have a pile there all the time that you can just help yourself, so it's free. So is this good for growing plants? Well, it has a pH of about 6.6, which is pretty much ideal for plants. It has an NPK of about 111, so it's about the same as all the other composts. It has a good level of organic matter, but it does have a bad reputation. For some reason, everybody thinks it has a high salt level. And so you're warned, don't use too much mushroom compost. It's high in salts. It's important to understand what the word salt means. To the layperson, salt is table salt, that thing you put on at dinner time. To a chemist, a salt is anything that's made out of iron. So all the nutrients that plants use, the nitrates, the phosphates, the potassium, those are all salts. When people say mushroom compost is high in salts, they're not talking about sodium, the table salt. They're talking about the nutrients that plants need. And in fact, the level isn't high at all. It's about the same as all other compost. So the salt level in mushroom compost isn't an issue. But there is one thing to be aware of. Because they add gypsum to this process, the resulting compost has fairly high levels of calcium, 2 to 3%. And that's very high for a compost. Now, if your soil is low on calcium anyways, that's a good thing. But most soil in North America is not deficient in calcium, and in fact, a lot of it has high levels of calcium. If your soil has high calcium levels, you may want to limit how much mushroom compost you use. But calcium is not very toxic to plants, so it's not a huge concern. The next one on our list is vermicompost. What's vermicompost? That's a fancy name for worm poop. So people actually grow worms, feed them kitchen scraps, and then collect the poop from those worms and use that in their garden. and it turns out to be pretty good for the garden. But how is this made inside the worm? So a lot of people think the worm eats all of these kitchen scraps, but it really doesn't want to eat that. What worms live on is bacteria. Commercially, a lot of vermicompost is made with manure. So they collect animal manure, feed it to the worms. The worms eat it mostly to get access to the bacteria in that manure. It gets ground up in their stomach, and it comes out the other end. There's very little decomposition that takes place, so vermicompost is not really producing a compost. It does produce a material where you and I can't see the bits of apple and the bits of lettuce anymore, so we call it a compost, but it's not really a composted material. Now that doesn't mean it's bad for the garden. So the NPK of this material is actually fairly high. It's usually around a 241. The middle number there, the 4, is the phosphate level. So it's pretty high in phosphate. And in fact, it's too high for most soil. Most soil has lots of phosphate and doesn't need more. The worms themselves excrete a lot of calcium during the digestion process. So vermicompost is also high in calcium. We've already talked about that can be good or bad depending on how much calcium you have in the soil. Vermicompost is by far the most expensive compost you can buy. Now, a lot of people use it because it has a lot of magic around it. People think it produces all kinds of great growth, but that's really not borne out by science. When vermicompost is compared to other types of compost, they really don't see any difference in the growth in plants. It's just an expensive compost. There's no magic about it. This brings me to the last compost I'm going to discuss, Bokashi composting. You can do Bokashi inside the house. You basically take a pail, you put in your kitchen scraps, you put in a special mixture of bran and microbes, mix it all together, cover it with a lid, and leave it for a couple of weeks. The material in there ferments, very similar to making pickles. And for that reason, this is not really a composting process, although it's called Bokashi compost. When you're finished, you'll still recognize the material in there. You'll see an apple core, an orange peel, a pickle. Now what you do is you take that material and you either put it on your compost pile and compost it, or you dig a hole in the garden, put it in a hole, cover it with soil, and let nature compost it. Now there are some advantages to this process. It means that you don't have to go outside in a cold winter to put material into a compost bin. You can do it in the kitchen instead. But it's not really compost, and you can't really buy Bokashi compost, the finished material. So let's take it off the list. So what is the best compost? Well, the answer is not that simple. Let's go back and understand why we're using the compost in the first place. One of the main reasons people use compost is to add nutrients to their garden. But all of the composts I've discussed have about the same NPK ratio, 1:1:1. Now, vermicompost is a little higher, but it's also much more expensive. So when you're looking at nutrients, all the composts are about the same. The second reason for using compost is to add organic matter to the soil. Now, the composts have different amounts of water in them, and you have to exclude that in your calculation. But if we're looking at dry compost, there's very little difference between them as far as the organic matter level goes. Now, sure, if a lab analyzed these, you'd find some small differences. But when you go and buy compost, they never tell you the organic matter level. So you're just guessing. So from a gardener's perspective, all of these composts have about the same amount of organic matter. And we really can't select the best compost based on this criteria. That leaves us with one criteria, cost. And for this reason, I consider home compost the best. You know what goes into that compost, you know it doesn't have any chemical contamination, and it's free. A close second best is Municipal compost. It's a pretty clean product except for the little bits of plastic. And if you can get that for free, that would be my second choice. Vermicompost has a higher NPK, but it's not much higher than the rest of the compost and has a very high price. So I never consider that. That leaves the other compost. And the best one is the one with the lowest price. A low price usually indicates that it's transported the least distances. And the more local you can buy a product, the better it is for the environment. Don't buy compost that's made across the country. Transporting that to where you are is terrible for the environment. Buy local. Now, the other component of cost is what's in the material. And you do have to watch out for low-priced bagged compost. I'm finding a lot of that material contains a lot of wood product. Now, there's nothing wrong with the wood, but you're paying for something you really don't want. You want a higher quality of compost that's made with manure, not with wood product. So sometimes paying a little bit more for bagged compost gets you a better product. But if at all possible, get bulk material. It's cheaper, it's usually local, and it's usually a better quality product. One of the key reasons for using compost in the garden is to build better soil. If you want to understand that process better and understand your soil better, have a look at my book, Soil Science for Gardeners. Click on the little icon of the book and that'll take you to my website, which has full information about that book. Happy gardening.